Logan gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white as the highway stretched endlessly before him. He hadn't planned on taking this trip, hadn't planned on much of anything lately. But after the breakup, after the suffocating weight of expectations from a life that no longer felt like his, he needed to get away. So he threw a bag in his truck, picked a direction, and just started driving. The road was supposed to clear his mind, give him space to breathe. Instead, all it did was remind him of everything he was trying to forget. He exhaled sharply and glanced at the gas gauge, almost empty. Great. A few more miles, and he'd be stranded in the middle of nowhere. He veered off the highway at the next exit, pulling into a tiny gas station in a town so small it didn't even have a name on the sign. As he stepped out of the truck, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. He stretched his aching limbs, rolling his shoulders, trying to shake the tension that had settled deep in his bones. And then he saw her. She was standing by an old Jeep, her brow furrowed as she examined the open hood. Her hair was piled messily on top of her head, loose strands falling around her face. She wiped her hands on her jeans, leaving behind streaks of grease. Frustration was written all over her face, and before Logan could think better of it, he was walking toward her. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. She looked up, startled, and for a second the world seemed to pause. Her eyes, warm brown with flecks of gold, met his, and an odd feeling settled in his chest. "Unless you've got magic powers or a spare radiator hose lying around, I'm afraid I'm out of luck," she sighed, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Logan smirked. "No magic powers, but I know my way around an engine. Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. "Be my guest, but I'm warning you, this thing is cursed." Logan leaned over the hood, inspecting the engine. It didn't take long to find the problem. "Your radiator hose is shot. You're not going anywhere until you replace it," she groaned. "Fantastic." Because being stranded in the middle of nowhere was exactly what I had in mind for today. He chuckled. "Lucky for you, I happen to be headed nowhere too." She lifted a brow, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Nowhere, huh? Sounds like an interesting destination." Logan straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "It has its perks. No expectations, no deadlines, just open roads and bad gas station coffee." She crossed her arms, studying him. "So you're running from something too?" The way she said it, like she understood, like she knew exactly what it felt like to need to escape, made something tighten in his chest. "Yeah," he admitted, "something like that." She exhaled, glancing back at her Jeep. "Well, unless a miracle happens, I'm stuck here. The nearest auto shop is 20 miles away, and I don't think hitchhiking is my best option." An idea formed before he could stop himself. "I could give you a ride." She blinked, studying him carefully. "You don't even know my name," he shrugged. "You don't know mine either." Her lips twitched. "Fair point, I'm Charlotte." "Logan." She chewed her lip, considering. "You could be a serial killer, you know," he smirked. "And you could be one too." "Guess we'll just have to take our chances." Charlotte laughed a real, genuine laugh that made something warm spread through his chest. It had been a long time since he'd heard a laugh like that. "All right, Logan," she said, grabbing her bag from the passenger seat of her Jeep. "Let's see where nowhere takes us." As she climbed into his truck, Logan had the strange feeling that he wasn't just giving a stranger a ride. He was stepping into something he hadn't expected, something that might just change the course of his entire trip, maybe even his entire life. The hum of the truck's engine filled the quiet space between them as Logan pulled back onto the highway, the sun sinking lower in the sky. Charlotte sat in the passenger seat, her fingers idly toying with the strap of her bag, her eyes flicking between the road ahead and the scenery rushing past the window. "So," she said after a few minutes, breaking the silence, "do you always pick up stranded strangers, or am I just lucky?" Logan smirked, keeping his eyes on the road. "Depends." "Do you always accept rides from potential serial killers?" Charlotte gave a small laugh, shaking her head. "Touché." The conversation lulled again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, there was an odd ease between them, like they had somehow skipped past the usual awkward introductions and settled into something familiar. Logan stole a glance at her, noticing the way her fingers tapped absent-mindedly against her knee, the way she exhaled slowly, as if trying to steady herself. There was something about her, a quiet weight in her expression, a restlessness that mirrored his own. "You heading somewhere specific?" he asked, turning the question on her. She hesitated, as if debating how much to say. "Not really," she admitted. "Just away." Logan nodded, understanding more than he probably should. They drove in silence for a while longer, the highway stretching out before them, the sky shifting from gold to deep orange. The road had always felt endless to him, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind the company. After an hour, Logan spotted a small roadside diner up ahead, a neon sign blinking weakly, promising coffee and home-cooked meals. His stomach reminded him he hadn't eaten since early that morning. "Hungry?" he asked, already flipping on his turn signal. Charlotte glanced at the diner and then back at him. "Depends. Do you always take your stranded passengers out to dinner?" he chuckled. "Only the ones who insult my truck," she grinned. "Fair enough." Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and freshly baked bread. A waitress with tired eyes and a friendly smile led them to a booth by the window. Logan slid into one side, Charlotte into the other. They ordered, Charlotte opting for pancakes at nearly 7 in the evening, which made Logan raise a brow. "What?" she said, catching his expression. "Breakfast for dinner is a superior life choice," he smirked. "I'll take your word for it." As they waited for their food, Charlotte leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "So what's your story, Logan? What are you running from?" His smirk faded. He could brush it off, keep it vague, but something about the way she asked, like she actually wanted to hear the answer, made him pause. "Life," he finally said, stirring the condensation on his water glass with the tip of his finger. "Expectations. A future I wasn't sure I wanted." Charlotte studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "That's a big thing to run from," he shrugged. "Yeah, well. I figured the road doesn't expect anything from me," she nodded slowly. "I get that." Their food arrived, but the conversation didn't fade. If anything, the more they talked, the easier it became. Charlotte told him about her past, a life that had always felt too small, a path that had been mapped out for her before she even had a say in it. "I was supposed to take over my family's business," she said, pushing a piece of pancake around her plate. "It's what everyone expected. But I woke up one morning and realized I didn't want that life, so I packed a bag, got in my Jeep, and just left." Logan leaned back, watching her carefully. "No plan," she shook her head. "Just the road." A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Guess that makes 2 of us." Charlotte met his gaze, something flickering in her expression, recognition, maybe. Like she had found something in him that mirrored a part of herself. They finished eating, and Logan paid before she could argue. Back in the truck, the night had fully settled, stars dotting the sky above them. They drove in comfortable silence, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Eventually, Charlotte yawned, stretching in her seat. "You planning to drive all night?" Logan considered it, then shook his head. "There's a motel a few miles up. We can stop there." She didn't argue, and when they finally pulled into the small parking lot, exhaustion had settled deep in both of them. Charlotte glanced at the 2-room motel. "Guess I should ask, are you expecting me to pay you back for the ride?" Logan smirked. "Nah, just don't snore," she laughed, shaking her head. "No promises." They got separate rooms, but as Logan laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another stop on the road. He had picked a direction and started driving, thinking he was escaping. But now, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he was running from something. Or toward something entirely unexpected. Logan woke before the sun, the faint hum of the highway outside his motel window, the only sound breaking the silence. He ran a hand over his face, the weight of sleep clinging to him, though his mind was already alert. Last night had been unexpected. Not just the fact that he had picked up a stranger, but the way talking to Charlotte had felt easy, natural, like they had known each other longer than a few hours. He had told her things he normally wouldn't admit to anyone, and somehow it hadn't felt like too much. Rolling out of bed, he grabbed his bag and headed for the door. The air was crisp, the sky still painted in the soft blues and purples of dawn. Across the parking lot, Charlotte sat on the hood of his truck, her legs tucked beneath her, a to-go coffee cup in her hands. She looked up as he approached, a small smile forming on her lips. "Figured you'd be an early riser," she said, holding out a second cup toward him. Logan took it, the warmth seeping into his fingers. "And you," she shrugged, "couldn't sleep. Thought I'd beat you to the good coffee, but turns out this town doesn't believe in decent caffeine." He chuckled, taking a sip. It was terrible, but he drank it anyway. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet of early morning wrapping around them like a comfortable blanket. "So, where to next?" Charlotte asked, glancing at him. Logan exhaled, leaning against the hood beside her. "Was thinking I'd just keep driving, no real destination in mind." She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Mind if I tag along a little longer?" The question caught him off guard, though it shouldn't have. He had half expected her to say something like that, but hearing it out loud made something shift inside him. He turned his head to look at her, searching her face for any hesitation. There wasn't any, just quiet curiosity, a hint of something he couldn't quite name. "You sure you want to keep trusting a stranger with your life?" he asked, a smirk playing at his lips. Charlotte smirked back. "I figure if you were going to murder me, you would have done it by now." Logan chuckled, shaking his head. "Fair enough." And just like that, it was decided. They hit the road again, the sun rising behind them, casting golden light across the empty highway. Charlotte flipped through the radio stations, settling on a song that was barely audible through the static. She hummed along, tapping her fingers against the dashboard. "You always this restless?" Logan asked, glancing at her. She exhaled, tilting her head back against the seat. "Not always, but lately." Yeah, he understood that feeling all too well. The miles passed quickly, conversation weaving effortlessly between them. Charlotte told him stories about growing up in a town where everyone knew everyone, where expectations felt suffocating, where she had always dreamed of leaving but never thought she actually would. Logan listened, offering pieces of himself in return, stories of a life that had been planned out for him, a future that had felt more like a burden than a choice. At some point, they stopped for gas, stretching their legs in the midday heat. Logan leaned against the truck, watching as Charlotte wandered toward a vending machine, her fingers tapping against the glass as she debated her options. "You gonna stare or actually help me decide?" She called over her shoulder. Logan smirked, pushing off the truck and walking over. "Go with the peanut butter cups, can't go wrong with those." Charlotte considered it for a second before pressing the button. The candy dropped, and she grabbed it, tearing open the wrapper as they walked back to the truck. She held out a piece toward him, and without thinking, he took it, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. Something passed between them in that touch, something small, but noticeable. Charlotte looked at him, her expression unreadable, and for the first time since they had met, Logan felt something shift, an awareness, a moment that could turn into something more. He cleared his throat, looking away. "We should get back on the road." Charlotte nodded, but there was something in her eyes when she looked at him again. Something he wasn't sure he was ready to name. They drove through the afternoon, the air between them charged in a way it hadn't been before. Logan could feel it, the way her gaze lingered on him a little longer than before, the way their conversations took on a softer edge. And when they finally pulled into another small town, another nameless motel, Logan realized something. This wasn't just a road trip anymore. This was something else entirely. The motel room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner rattling against the window. Logan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, thoughts swirling in his head. He had been on the road for weeks now, but this traveling with Charlotte was different. It was no longer just about escaping, it was something else. He heard a knock. Soft, hesitant. When he opened the door, Charlotte stood there, barefoot, her hair damp from a shower, wearing an oversized t-shirt and a pair of shorts. She looked as unsure as he felt. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, hugging her arms against her body. Logan stepped aside, letting her in without a word. She sat at the foot of his bed, pulling her knees up to her chest, looking out the window into the darkened parking lot. He leaned against the dresser, arms crossed, watching her carefully. "You ever think about where you're going to end up?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. Logan exhaled through his nose. "Not really, been too busy running to think about the destination." Charlotte nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket absent-mindedly. "Yeah, same." A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt heavier than usual, charged with something neither of them had put into words yet. She lifted her gaze to his. "What if we just kept going?" His heart kicked up, but he kept his expression neutral. "You saying you want to make this permanent?" Her lips curved slightly, but there was something vulnerable in her eyes, something hesitant. "I don't know, she sighed, shaking her head. "I don't want to go back, not yet." Something in Logan's chest tightened. He understood that, understood it too well. "You don't have to," he said simply. Charlotte studied him for a long moment, and he could feel the air shift between them, growing heavier, charged with something neither one of them acknowledged outright. She was close enough that he could see the way her breath hitched slightly, the way her fingers curled into the fabric of her shirt. And then, as if realizing how close they were, she swallowed hard and pushed herself up from the bed. "I should get some sleep," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Logan nodded, his throat unbearably dry. "Yeah, probably a good idea." She hesitated for a fraction of a second before heading toward the door. As she reached for the handle, she glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "Night, Logan," she said softly, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. "Night, Charlotte." And then she was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of shampoo and the lingering warmth of something he was trying too damn hard not to name. The next day, the air between them was different. Not awkward, not tense, but cautious, like they were both aware of something they hadn't spoken aloud yet. They drove through the countryside, the road stretching long and endless ahead of them. Charlotte had her feet propped up on the dashboard, sunglasses perched on her nose, humming along to the song playing softly through the speakers. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Logan glanced at her. "Stopping," she nodded. "You know, settling down, finding a place to stay for more than a few nights." He considered the question, rolling it around in his head. "I don't know if I'm built for that." Charlotte turned her head slightly, studying him. "Why not?" Logan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Because every time I think about it, it feels like being trapped." Charlotte was quiet for a moment before she said, "Maybe it's not about where you are. Maybe it's about who you're with." Logan's jaw clenched. He didn't respond, but something about her words sat heavy in his chest. They drove in silence for a while, the conversation lingering between them, unfinished. Eventually, they pulled into a small coastal town, the salty breeze rolling through the open windows. Logan parked near the beach, and without a word, they both got out, walking toward the shore. Charlotte kicked off her shoes, letting the sand bury her toes. Logan followed, shoving his hands into his pockets, watching as the waves rolled in. She turned to him suddenly, the wind catching her hair, making it whip around her face. "What if this was it?" Logan frowned. "What do you mean?" Charlotte gestured around them. "What if this was where we stopped, just for a little while?" Logan studied her, something stirring deep in his chest. "You want to stay?" She bit her lip, hesitating. "I don't know. Maybe just for a bit. Maybe just to see what it feels like to not be running." Logan exhaled, looking out at the ocean. The idea of stopping had never appealed to him before. But with Charlotte standing there, looking at him like that, Maybe, just maybe, it didn't seem so bad, and that terrified him. Logan had never been one to hesitate. His entire life had been built on moving forward, making decisions without looking back. But standing there on the edge of the beach, listening to Charlotte suggest stopping just for a little while, he found himself at war with something he couldn't quite name. Charlotte watched him, the wind in her hair, her face half shadowed by the setting sun. She wasn't pressuring him, wasn't asking for anything more than consideration. But still, the weight of her words sat heavy in his chest. Stopping meant acknowledging that something had shifted, that this wasn't just about escaping anymore. But maybe he wasn't just running from something. Maybe he was running toward her. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and glanced back at the small coastal town behind them. The streets were quiet, the kind of place that didn't demand anything from you, a place where time slowed down. "We'd need a place to stay," he said finally, the words foreign in his mouth. Charlotte's lips parted slightly, like she hadn't expected him to agree so easily. Then, slowly, a smile crept across her face. "I saw a bed and breakfast on the way in. We could check it out." And just like that, Logan found himself doing something he never thought he would, staying still. The bed and breakfast was small, tucked away on the edge of town, overlooking the sea. The woman who ran the place, an older woman named Margaret, eyed them curiously as they walked in, windblown and carrying only their overnight bags. "Passing through?" she asked, handing them a key. Charlotte hesitated, then glanced at Logan. "Actually, we might stay a little while." Margaret's gaze flicked between them, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Well, in that case, welcome to Seabrook." Their room was simple white curtains that billowed in the evening breeze, a small balcony with a view of the ocean. It felt peaceful. Charlotte dropped her bag onto the bed, stretching her arms over her head with a soft sigh. "I can't believe we're actually doing this." Logan leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "Me neither." She turned to face him, something unreadable in her expression. "Does it scare you?" He didn't answer right away. Because yes, it did. It terrified him. But not in the way he expected. What scared him wasn't stopping it, was the fact that, for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to leave. Instead of saying any of that, he simply said, "A little." Charlotte nodded, as if she understood exactly what he wasn't saying. Then, with a small smile, she turned toward the window. "I think this might be good for us." Us. Logan swallowed hard, the words settling deep in his bones. Yeah, he thought so too. The days blended together in a way that felt effortless. Mornings spent walking along the beach, afternoons filled with exploring the town, nights sitting on the balcony, listening to the waves. Logan found work at the local marina, helping repair boats, while Charlotte started spending time at a small cafe in town, chatting with the owner about possibly helping out. It felt easy. Too easy, and that was the problem. Because deep down, Logan knew that things this good never lasted. It was late when he finally admitted it to himself. He was sitting on the balcony, the sea breeze cool against his skin, when Charlotte stepped outside, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She sat beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. "You're quiet tonight," he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Just thinking." She didn't push, didn't press for answers, she just waited. Finally, he said, "What happens when this stops feeling like an escape?" Charlotte turned to him, her expression soft but serious. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've been pretending like this is temporary, but what if it's not?" He looked at her, searching her face. "What if this is real?" Charlotte was silent for a long moment. Then finally she said, "Would that be so bad?" Logan's chest tightened. "No. But it would mean we have to stop pretending we don't feel something more than this." Charlotte swallowed, her fingers gripping the blanket a little tighter. "And is that what you want?" "More?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." The word hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Charlotte's breath hitched, her eyes searching his. And then, slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his. Logan didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. Whatever this was, whatever they were, it wasn't something he could ignore anymore. And for once, he wasn't afraid to stay. Logan had never felt anything quite like this before. Sitting on the balcony, Charlotte's fingers entwined with his, the distant crash of waves filling the silence between them. He realized something. This was the first time in years he wasn't thinking about the next move, the next road, the next escape. He was here, with her. And for once he didn't want to leave. Charlotte's thumb brushed over his knuckles absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon. The weight of what they had just admitted to each other still hung between them, thick and undeniable. She turned to him, her brown eyes searching his. "So what now?" Logan exhaled, running his free hand over his jaw. It was a simple question, but it carried so much weight. What now? He had spent so long avoiding commitment, avoiding attachment, but Charlotte had become an exception to every rule he had set for himself. He didn't want this to be temporary. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "But I know I don't want to lose this." Charlotte's lips parted slightly, her fingers tightening around his. "Me neither." A breeze rolled in from the ocean, lifting strands of her hair across her face. Without thinking, Logan reached up, tucking them behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her skin, his pulse hammering in his throat. Her breath hitched. The space between them seemed to shrink, an invisible pull drawing them closer. Logan's gaze flickered to her lips, soft, parted, waiting. And then, finally, he kissed her. The moment his lips met hers, everything else faded. The world, the past, the uncertainty, none of it mattered. All that existed was the warmth of her mouth against his, the way she inhaled sharply at the contact, the way her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, holding him there like she had been waiting for this just as long as he had. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, as if they were tasting something they had both been longing for but too afraid to claim. Charlotte pressed closer, her body molding against his, and Logan's arms wrapped around her instinctively, pulling her in. When they finally broke apart, Charlotte rested her forehead against his, her breath uneven. "Well," she whispered, a teasing smile tugging at her lips. "That answers that question." Logan let out a breathless chuckle, his fingers still tangled in her hair. "Yeah. I guess it does." They stayed like that for a while, wrapped up in each other, the night wrapping around them like a secret. And for the first time in his life, Logan wasn't thinking about where the road would take him next, because he had already found where he belonged. The following weeks passed in a blur, a beautiful, effortless blur. Logan had never thought settling down, even temporarily, could feel so natural, but with Charlotte, everything did. They fell into an easy rhythm. Mornings spent tangled in bed, afternoons filled with laughter and stolen kisses, evenings walking along the beach, hands entwined like they had been doing this forever. Logan found himself memorizing the little things about her, the way she hummed absently when she was lost in thought, the way she scrunched her nose when she was about to challenge him on something, the way she fit perfectly against him when they lay together at night. He was falling, fast, and for once he wasn't afraid. One evening, as they sat on the sand, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Charlotte sighed contentedly, leaning against his shoulder. "I don't want this to end," she murmured. Logan pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Then it doesn't have to." She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "You mean that?" He cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "Yeah, I do." A slow smile spread across her lips, something soft and hopeful shining in her eyes. "So we stop running," Logan nodded. "We stop running." Charlotte exhaled a breath of relief, then laughed softly. "I never thought I'd want to stay anywhere but with you." She trailed off, biting her lip. Logan tilted her chin up gently. "With me." She met his gaze, unwavering. "With you, it doesn't feel like staying, it just feels like home." Logan's chest tightened, emotions swelling in his throat. He had spent his whole life searching for something, a purpose, a direction, a reason to stop drifting. And now he realized he had found it, not in a place, but in a person, in her. "I love you," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Charlotte's breath caught, her eyes widening slightly. And then, a slow, radiant smile spread across her face. "I love you too." Logan exhaled sharply, like he had been holding his breath for years, and finally, he could breathe. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with everything he had, pouring every unspoken word, every unexpressed feeling into the way their mouths met, the way their bodies pressed together as if they had always belonged to each other. There was no more uncertainty, no more questions. They weren't running anymore, because together they had finally found everything they had been searching for.